So I think I've covered everything except for the really bad news. And this is where everybody starts to hate me in knitting. But you have to wash your swatch. When it is done, you have to wash it exactly the way that you're going to wash your sweater, and you have to dry it exactly the way that you're going to dry your sweater. If you're using a cotton yarn, this is great. You can wash it in the washing machine and dry it in the dryer. If you're using a superwash yarn, you can probably do the same thing. If you're using a non-superwash yarn, a wool or an alpaca, then you're going to have to hand wash it and lay it flat to dry. It's not that big of a deal, and it's going to save you so much time farther down the road. I cannot stress this enough. Gauge is known to change after washing, especially in a garment which has a lot of weight to pull the piece down. So if you do not wash your swatch, then you do not know what the gauge of your final garment is going to be. And that means that the size of your final garment will potentially change a lot the first time you wash it, which might render it unwearable. And that's too horrible for me to even imagine happening to any of you. So please wash your swatches before you measure your gauge. Everything that we calculate for the measurements of your garment are going to be based on this, the true gauge. So it means that the garment that you knit might not look like it's the right size as you're knitting it. But since you did wash your swatch and you know how your fiber is going to behave in the long run, you know that the sweater will fit you after the first washing and blocking, which is, it's good. This is also why I don't really like to knit sweaters top down. I have a feeling that we're going to get asked about why this sweater is not going to be knit top down, and it's because it's a false sense of security. If you're trying on your sweater while you're knitting it top down, then you might think that you've knit it until it fits, but as soon as it hits the water, the size changes. So it's not actually any easier, and in fact, can be kind of difficult. I think we're about there. The only other thing is that I did weight my swatch. I mentioned before that a finished garment has weight from all the fiber that's in it that a swatch doesn't have. Swatches are pretty light. So what I did with this was I pinned it to my bulletin board and I attached a few clothespins to the bottom, and I left it like that after washing and drying for 36 hours, 48 hours. I don't remember. Anything more than 24 should be fine. Just to simulate what would happen to the fabric when it actually has weight on it in the actual garment. And once that was done, I was ready to measure my gauge. I chose this central swatch as my favorite piece of the fabric. The one knit on size 5 needles I felt was a little bit too stiff, and the one knit on size 7 needles I felt was a little bit too open. I don't know if you can really see, but I'm looking at you through the fabric right now. It's a little airier than I wanted for a sweater. So I chose the in-between, which has some stretch but is also nice and solid, and will make a pretty warm sweater, which is what I'm going for. So I noted that I knit that on size 6 Zephyrs. That's what I'm going to be using for my entire sweater. And now it is time to measure gauge. In order to do this, you're going to need the swatch that you've chosen, your measuring tool, and a calculator that does multiplication and division. That's really all you're going to need. And once again, everything is filled out on the worksheet so that you can do it once you've downloaded. The first thing that you do is measure your stitch gauge. So the stitches are these little V's that your fabric is made up of, and you count them across a row. So if you line them up in your view sizer, starting at the very edge of one of the V's, and count across to 4 inches, then you'll see that we have about 1, 2, 3. Ooh, I don't like doing this upside down. 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 stitches to the inch. If you count all the way to 4, then you'll get the most accurate measurement. And that's how you're going to do it. Make sense? The next thing you want to do is measure your rows in the same way. So now we're measuring the little V's from top to bottom rather than from side to side. So again, you line up your starting point with the very tip top of one of them, and then count the individual stitches all the way along until you hit 4 inches. And you'll write that number down too. So now you have your number of stitches per 4 inches and your number of rows per 4 inches. And you're going to divide each of these numbers by 4 to get your stitches per inch and rows per inch. And these are the numbers that you're going to use for all your further calculations in the pattern. If your number has a decimal at the end of it, leave that on. It's okay, we're going to address how to deal with that when it's time to cast on. You just want to be as accurate as possible. And the last thing that we're going to do in this lesson is take our measurements. I recommended last week, and I still recommend that you use a favorite sweater to do this. But if you really don't have one, then you can follow the schematic and take the same measurements on your own body or on a sweatshirt, a t-shirt, any garment that fits you the way that you like the sweater to. If you do take it on your own body, you might want to get someone to help you with certain measurements, and it's fine to take them over your clothes and add a little bit of ease if you want your piece to fit a little more loosely. So here's my favorite sweater. It fits me perfectly. I love it a lot. The only problem is that I did shrink it once, so it's a little bit shorter than I would really like it to be. Fortunately, it's really easy to add length to garments. So I'm going to basically just stretch it out into the shape that I like it in. And I'm going to compare it to the schematic that is in your handout. We have, I think it's 10 measurements that you want to take. One along the bottom hem, one along the narrowest part of the waist, one from armpit to armpit, the overall length of the torso, the length from the hem to the narrowest part of the waist, the length of the sleeve from underarm to cuff, the width of the sleeve at the very end and the width at the top, the distance from the underarm to the side of the neckline, and the width across the back of the neck, which I'll actually also be changing from this sweater because the neckline is a little bit wider than I really want. And you're going to take these measurements with a plain old tape measure or a T-square or a ruler. It doesn't really matter. And as you saw, there is a place on the worksheet to fill them in. So you'll want to fill in your inches or centimeters if you're metric. And if you are, good for you. I don't know how you do it. And this is what we're going to use for all of the subsequent lessons. So you can get to measuring right now. I think that taking the time to experiment with swatching is going to really be worth it in the long run. Taking time to do your measurements well is also going to pay off. This is really what designing is all about. These are like your first dates with your materials and your honeymoon period. So enjoy it and do it conscientiously because this is the investment that's going to pay off in a really great sweater. I'm Nina, and this was the first lesson of your Design Your Sweater class. I'll see you next week where we'll finally cast on.